Lord, your spirit of truth, who art everywhere present and fillest all things, treasury of good gifts and giver of life, come and abide in us, and cleanse us of all impurity, and save our souls, O good one.
Got it broadcasting. Let's start with today's saints, martyrs Ina, Pina, and Rima. Mary, take it away. Yeah, speak loudly.
Oh, great.
Martyrs Ina, Pina, and Rima. The three Slavic martyrs were disciples of the apostle Andrew, the first called. These martyrs preached the gospel of Christ throughout Syria, modern-day Bulgaria. As a result of the three martyrs' preachings, they managed to convert many barbarian Goths, baptizing them into the true faith. Because of their faith in the Lord, these three martyrs were seized by the chieftain of Scythia, who was a pagan idol worshiper. Ina, Pina, and Rima were pressured to deny Christ and were commanded to offer sacrifices to the idols. However, these martyrs refused to deny Christ, and they refused to offer sacrifices to the idols. As a result of their refusals, the martyrs were taken to a freezing lake, where they were tied to logs above the lake and exposed to the icy winter weather. Their bodies were slowly lowered into the frozen lake, and when it reached their necks, these courageous martyrs surrendered their souls to our Lord.
Are they men or women?
Three men.
Well, that's one of the things that's interesting about these martyrs. Their names, Ina, Pina, and Rima, are feminine.
Yeah.
And according to the Antiochian martyrology, they were women. But the Russian martyrology has them as men. They were disciples of St. Andrew the First called, and they accompanied him in his evangelization of Scythia and then ultimately of Rus to Kiev. And he had ordained them priests. The other thing that the Russian martyrology has is that they were martyred in the Crimea, not in Bulgaria. So I mean, there's some lack of solid information about their lives, but every life confirms that they were killed by being attached to these poles that were driven into the frozen water, and that they basically froze to death. Then also, another life was saying that local Christians secretly buried them, and then they removed after Christianity took hold, they removed the relics to the local cathedral. And they appeared in a dream to a local bishop who commanded him to translate their relics to the port of Alisk, which apparently is associated with the modern city of Alushta, wherever that is, but it's in the Crimea. They're considered patron saints of Crimea, and they were considered the first martyrs of Rus. This is long before the baptism of Rus.
Where did they meet the Apostle Andrew?
In Scythia, modern day Bulgaria. That's where they're from.
On his journey.
Well, the apostles as a whole traveled around a lot of different regions, preaching the gospel, converting people, and they would establish local churches, ordain bishops and priests, and then they'd move on. And most famously, of course, we see this with Apostles Peter and Paul, and then I guess also Thomas, who very famously is the Johnny-come-lately to every important event that happens. And so those three, it's fairly well known, but the rest of the apostles were also doing the same thing. They divided up the regions where each of them would go preach.
Did you read everything you have
There's a troparion.
You read that?
Read it.
Your holy martyrs, Ina, Pina, and Rima, O Lord, through their sufferings have received incorruptible crowns from you, our God. For having your strength, they laid low their adversaries and shattered the powerless boldness of demons. Through their intercession, save our souls.
Just the general troparion deniers.
Which is probably understandable because I doubt that there is an extant service to these martyrs that would have been written after their martyrdom. If there was a specific service for them, I doubt that it survived. And so the general is adapted for their specific use. Another interesting thing about this, in the life of St. Andrew the Apostle, it is said that he got to Kiev and he prophesied that a great city and civilization were going to be founded there. And this also shows up in their lives that they were with him when he did that. And that they were actually martyred, according to one life, in Kiev. And a cathedral was built in the spot where they were martyred.
So, all these different stories, why are there so many different stories? One they're men, one they're women, one they're in Russia.
Good question. Why are there so many different stories, or different accounts, or
Well,
different little tidbits?
A long time ago.
First
And there was
century.
no church, there was no church structure around there at the time.
No.
So they were killed in Krim?
Well, that's one
According to what
one
story?
account. Another account is that they were martyred in Bulgaria. I mean, both of those are not too far from the Black Sea. So, I mean, it's all in the southern Slavic region. And in the first century, the modern day nations and even the peoples weren't really located there yet. The Bulgars didn't come till much later.
But both regions were occupied by Turks a lot of
And that came even
times.
later. Yeah.
Maybe that's why everything is lost.
Well, certainly that, but even before that, from the first century, I mean, when did Kirill Methodius go and proselytize the southern Slavs?
607
Well, who sent them out?
Greeks.
Who specifically sent Saints Kirill and Methodius?
I read it.
Holy Saint Patriarch Photius the Great. When did he? When was he Patriarch of Constantinople? 9th century.
Right around 1000, around
800s.
before the schism.
800s. So the southern Slavs aren't proselytized by the people who actually convert them, Kirill and Methodius and their disciples, for another 700 years.
Right.
When did when was Kiev baptized?
988.
988. That's another 100 and some years
Yeah.
beyond Kirill and Methodius.
Right.
So you're looking at
Very old history.
700, 800, 900 years after the lives of these people.
An interesting thing to bring up, I think, is this modern scholarship thing where we have records, but to really consider how many things have been lost,
Yeah.
because it's not as simple as some of these scholars. It's like, well, if I don't have, documented proof of this, it's just nonsense. It's like,
Well, I mean, what written document is going to survive? 100 years, you could sit it in a room by itself for 200 years, it's going to disintegrate.
And oral tradition is likely to survive.
Well, and that's the case with these things. You're dealing with primarily oral traditions. And let's face it, who's the definitive biographer of the apostles?
Well, there's the Acts of the Apostles.
Well, the Acts of the Apostles gives some episodes of their lives, but it's not a definitive biography
No.
as Seraphim was saying in the modern sense.
Right.
Basically, we have the scriptures. And and then
We
the
do have-
traditions of the
We do have
church.
the scriptures, those have survived.
Do you know what the oldest extant text of the scriptures is, the New Testament? It dates, I believe, from the 4th or the 5th century.
Aren't there some Dead Sea Scrolls?
Dead Sea Scrolls are not the New Testament.
I thought they had some
They have
bits of it.
They have writings that are akin to, or perhaps the New Testament is incorporated into them, or maybe they're incorporating some of it. It's a little hard to say which way it goes. So there's overlap, but the Dead Sea Scrolls are not themselves the antecedents of the New Testament. The Dead Sea Scrolls were from a group of Jewish.
Well, I wasn't saying they like led to it. I thought there was some extant New Testament type thing. But I
They're
could be
from
wrong.
the Essenes, which was
Okay.
a group of
Yeah,
Messianic Jews who were from that time.
yeah.
And there is a lot of overlap
hmm
between what the Essenes were teaching and what Jesus Christ was teaching. So it's quite possible that the Essenes were influenced by Christ, but they themselves were never
Mhm.
Christian.
Okay.
So, I mean, what we're dealing with is a paucity of written record that goes back anywhere near that far.
Okay.
And as far as the printed word goes back, how long has printing been around? Movable type. That dates from the 15th century. Okay, any other thoughts about these saints? Thank you, Mary. Very good. Very nicely done. Saint Innocent. Actually, we should take Saint John Maximovich first, because he predates Saint Innocent. And Michael, thank you.
Yes, and I have an icon that actually has both St. John on the right and St. Innocent. I mean, St. John he's on the left of the icon, and then St. Innocent, but that's Irkutsk. Is that
Right.
Yeah, that's, all
So, okay,
right.
so both, and that's upstairs, from upstairs.
So be sure that you include why these two saints are included in the same icon
Yes.
in your description of the life.
Okay, I found a really good thing of internet, so I'll start with that. So before I start with the life of St. John of Tobolsk, who's a distant relative of St. John Maximovich of Shanghai and San Francisco, there's a little bit to discuss about the Great Caves Monastery of Kiev. So the Great Caves Monastery of Kiev was from the earliest years of Orthodox Christianity in Russia, a fount of sanctity for the whole of the Russian land. The monastery was destroyed in the Tartar invasion of the 13th century, but it was later restored, and again in the 17th century, it entered upon a period of spiritual blossoming that produced a whole series of holy hierarchs. Among them, to name only the closest contemporaries and associates of St. John, were St. Dmitri of Rostov, 1651 to 1709, St. Theodosius of Chernigov, 1630 to 1696, and Blessed Philothos of Tobolsk, 1727. Slightly later, there was such holy men as St. Innocent of Irkutsk, 1680 to 1731, St. Iosaf of Belgorod, 1705 to 1754, and St. Paul of Tobolsk, 1705 to 1770. In this company of hierarch saints, St. John of Tobolsk occupies his own significant place. And so this is his life. A member of, I'll pass this around too for a map, if you want to, this is a map of Ukraine where a lot of his activity took place before he was sent to Siberia, where Tobolsk is.
Did you share it with Seraphim?
Yes, which is quite a ways away in West Siberia from Ukraine.
Yeah.
Okay. Hundreds and hundreds of miles.
What's that in versts?
What's that?
In verse.
Verse. Okay.
Now 4 days by the train.
Days on the train,
Okay, a member of the noble family of Maximovich, which enjoyed high favor with the Russian Tsars, St. John was born one of 6 brothers in the year 1651 in the city of Nezhin in central Russia, which is now Ukraine. Already in his childhood, he was particularly fond of reading the Word of God and the writings of the Holy Fathers, and he loved to attend the services of the church. This strong religious inclination in his early youth determined the whole of his latter life. The future hierarch was educated in the Kiev College of Metropolitan Peter Mogilov, which was later transformed into a theological academy. There he learned to love theological studies, to which he gave himself with all the ardor of youth, and he finished the course brilliantly. He remained there to teach for 8 years, showing himself to be an industrious scholar and a deeply religious man. At the same time, from his visits to the Caves Monastery in Kiev, there was planted in him a burning desire for the monastic life, and it was there that he became a monk. In the Lavra, the young ascetic revealed himself as highly gifted in letters and in the art of oratory. When in 1677 the Turks were threatening to attack the Ukraine, the then hieromonk John was chosen by the monks, despite his youth, as their envoy to Tsar Fyodor Alexeyevich to ask for help in the face of the threatened destruction of the Lavra. The Tsar sent a strong detachment and designated Svensk Monastery near Bryansk to be the place of refuge for the monks of the Lavra in case of attack, and hieromonk John was appointed its abbot. This brought out the humble ascetic from the holy caves of Kiev and placed him high on the church candlestand to shine before men. For the next 20 years, Father John was placed at the head of various monasteries in southern Russia, inspiring the monks by his personal example and great ascetic endeavor. The holy life and great talents of Abbot John soon came to the attention of St. Theodosius, Archbishop of Chernigov. St. Theodosius Uglitsky was a model hierarch and Orthodox enlightener full of flaming love and devotion to his flock. After his death, he manifested his greatness before God with an abundance of miraculous intercessions coming from his incorruptible relics. He called St. John with the idea of making him his successor at Chernigov. In 1695, he made him archimandrite of Aletsky Monastery, at which he had himself once been the abbot. In the next year, 1696, St. Theodosius died, but his closeness to his chosen successor did not end with his death. For St. John himself received the first miraculous healing by the prayers of St. Theodosius. To St. John, who was seriously ill with influenza and apparently on his deathbed, St. Theodosius appeared and said, "Do not sorrow, brother. The Lord has heard your prayers, and you will be well. Rise from your bed and prepare to serve the divine liturgy. This will be a sign to you." Awakening after the vision, the saint had his vicar informed that he would serve on the following day. Because of his condition, these words were ascribed to delirium, but in fact, on the following day, the saint, already well, served the liturgy. After this healing, St. John ordered the cave opened where St. Theodosius was buried, and he hung there a large portrait of his healer, himself composing some verses for an inscription. The logical successor to St. Theodosius, St. John, was unanimously elected Archbishop of Chernigov by the local clergy and officials and sent to Moscow with a request of the Tsar and Patriarch to consecrate him for Chernigov. The consecration took place on January 10, 1697. Chernigov was a flourishing city not far from Kiev. St. Theodosius had seen well to the Orthodox enlightenment and education of his diocese, and St. John, his worthy successor, took up this task where the great saint had left off. St. John understood well that for fruitful results in church life, more was needed than his own personal efforts, and so he worked to educate the clergy. For this purpose, he established a diocesan college similar to the Kievan Academy, which was to become, according to the saint's idea, a Chernigovan Athens of enlightened piety. The high level of its theological education, its instruction in the rules of Christian living made this school widely known. It became a pattern, an imitation of which seminaries began to be opened in other dioceses. St. John strove always to live the life of his flock. He taught the truths of Christian faith and life in a form accessible to the simplest of his listeners, and he pointed to the grace-bestowing powers of the Holy Church, which aid one to stand firmly on the path of salvation. The lofty virtues which the life of St. John shone were reflected also in his many writings, a list of which follows. 1. The Mirror of Moral Instruction in 1703 and 1707. Alphabet of Saints in verse in 1705. O Mother of God, Virgin, also in verse, 1707. Commentary on the 30th Psalm, 1708. A meditation on the prayer, Our Father, in verse, in 1709. The 8 Beatitudes of the Gospel, in verse, in 1709. The Royal Way of the Cross, in 1709. Religious Reflections, in 1710 to 11. And Heliotropion, in 1714, all published in Chernigof. His most important work, Heliotropion, was begun by St. John while he was still a teacher in the Academy of Peter Mogila. He published it in Latin, and only later in Tobolsk, when he had completed it in its final form, did he publish it in Slavonic.
I
The
think
title-
that was just recently translated into English.
That's good. Yeah, there is a little quote I'm going to have from there, so that's probably part from that. And I guess what I heard was that was that common at that time with that monastery to learn everything in Latin, and then so.
Finish your life and we'll get into that.
Okay. Okay, let's see. The title is the Greek word for helianthus, which means sunflower. The image of the sunflower, dear to the saint even from his youth, was for him an analogy which helps to explain the agreement of the human will with the will of God. The sunflower has the particular characteristic of daily turning its face from one side to the other, following the movement of the sun. Sunflowers are a common sight in the rural landscape of southern Russia, and St. John could not but be attracted by the natural symbolism they afford. The book Heliotropion, in fact, treats of the divine and human wills. These are quotes. The only true mean for attaining our happiness in this life and in the next is the constant turning of our attention within ourselves to our own conscience, to our thoughts, words, and deeds, so as to raise them to passionlessness. This will reveal to us our mistakes in life and indicate the only path to salvation. This path is the entire devotion of our whole being, of our whole self, with all the circumstances of our life to the will of God. As a symbol of this turning to God, we may use the growth of the sunflower. Let it be ever before our eyes. And here's another quote. Christians, observe once and for all how the sunflower, even on gloomy days, pursues its circular course, following the sun with the unchanging love and attraction natural to it. Our sun, illuminating our path through the world, is the will of God. It does not always illuminate our path in life without clouds. Often clear days are followed by gloomy ones. Rain, wind, and storms arise. But let our love for our sun, the will of God, be so strong that we may continue inseparably from it, even in days of misfortune and sorrow, like the sunflower on gloomy days, to navigate faultlessly on the sea of life, following the indications of the barometer and compass of the will of God, which leads us into the safe harbor of eternity. In the words of this ascetic of faith, there is placed before us the spiritually transfigured man filled with the determination to accept in all things the will, good, and perfect of the Heavenly Father. It will seem to us, that's another quote, it will seem to us that we are deprived of everything, even if we have a great abundance in everything. We will always be in fear, despondent, agitated, faint-hearted, every hour full of cares and various anxieties, sorrow and vain sighing, until we sincerely return to God and devote ourselves and each other completely to the will of God, as the sunflower strives toward the sun. Let us begin diligently to examine the visible signs of God's will in events and conform our will to them. Let the will of God be for us the guiding star in life. Let each of us engrave and hold forever in his heart this one thing. Blessed be the name of the Lord. From Job chapter 1. In 1700, Tsar Peter I ordered the Metropolitan of Kiev to select a suitable candidate for the mission of preaching the gospel to the pagan peoples of the vast Siberian lands. 2 of St. John's close schoolmates were chosen for this task, being assigned to the rapidly growing Siberian diocese of Tobolsk. The first choice was St. Dmitry Tuptulo, who, however, due to his frail health, was never sent to Tobolsk, but rather to Rostov. In his place, Blessed Philothus Leschinsky was made metropolitan and sent to Tobolsk, and his zeal, his ascetic life, His ascetic life and his love for the natives earned for him recognition as one of Russia's greatest missionaries. In 1709, Metropolitan Philotheus became sick and, thinking of his end near, took the great schema and retired to private ascetic labors. St. John was called to succeed him in the Tobolsk Cathedra. His friend in Chernigov, St. John, had by this time earned the unquestioning respect and love of his flock, being known as a great man of prayer and an outstanding prince of the church. He was adorned also with supernatural gifts, such as the ability to see the future. He predicted Tsar Peter's victory over the Swedes, and in the Tobolsk Chronicles, it is recorded that he foresaw the Napoleonic invasion a century in advance. In the middle of the year 1711, St. John left Chernigov with its culture to bring the light of Christianity to the cold and primitive Siberian frontier. For his protection, he took with him a copy of a miraculous Chernigov icon of the Mother of God, that of Ilyin, which only several decades before had manifested the rare miracle of tears and had granted since then numerous miraculous healings. He arrived in the middle of August of the same year with a great suite: church singers, educated clergymen, episcopal vestments, service books, together with many trunks. He at once gained the respected admiration of all and was able, without difficulty, to apply himself to missionary endeavors. Always a friend of education, St. John took loving care of the school established by his predecessor. He established courses in icon painting. He took charge of local missionary work, freeing Schema Metropolitan Philotheus to preach Christ to the wild tribes farther away. He sent a well-equipped mission to Peking. Interestingly, the largest and most active center of Orthodoxy in China would be headed 2 centuries later by his relative, St. John Maximovich, Bishop of Shanghai, whose life and activity strikingly resembled that of St. John of Tobolsk. St. John loved to do good in secret. He sent money and various things to trustworthy persons, to almshouses and the homes of poor people, especially to widows. He would go to a widow, knock and say, "Accept this in the name of Jesus Christ," then quickly leave. He grieved especially over impoverished clergymen. He was drawn with his whole soul to wherever there was sorrow or need. He loved to go to prisons. He comforted, taught, and likewise diverted the prisoners with gifts. He never went out just to visit, and he never stopped into the houses of the rich. Even while occupied with his many pastoral cares, St. John also led a life of the strictest asceticism. In his personal life, he was quiet, humble, compassionate, and very strict with himself. Possessing a great capacity for work, he was never idle. He was always reading or writing, teaching or thinking. Above all, he prayed. Shutting himself up in his cell, he would pray for hours on his knees. For his God-pleasing deeds, St. John was granted a righteous death that revealed the sanctity of his earthly life. Foreseeing his approaching death, he prepared for it. The evening before, he went to confession, and the next day, June 10, 1715, he solemnly celebrated the Divine Liturgy. Afterwards, as was his custom on major feast days, he held a dinner in his quarters for the city clergymen and the poor. He himself waited on the ladder, thus literally obeying the gospel injunction: "When thou makest a feast, call the poor, the maimed, the lame, the blind, and thou shalt be blessed. For they cannot recompense thee, for thou shalt be recompensed at the resurrection of the just." After the dinner, the saint touchingly bade farewell to his clergy, and then briefly detained 2 of his best-loved priests. What he said to them was never divulged. Having dismissed them, he closed himself in his inner chambers. Before Vespers, when it was customary to ask the Metropolitan's blessing for the ringing of the bells, his house servants came many times to his quarters, knocked and called him, but the door did not open, and they heard no voice. The residents of Tobolsk, who deeply revered and loved the Metropolitan, did not hear the bells for Vespers at the usual time. And having been thrown into confusion by the tales that quickly spread through the city about the entirely extraordinary farewell of St. John with his clergy, they gathered in large numbers in the enclosure before the bishop's house. Finally, the Siberian governor, Prince Gagarin, arrived, and after renewed vain attempts to call the Metropolitan, he took the responsibility upon himself and ordered the door broken. There they beheld Metropolitan John in an attitude of prayer on his knees before the holy icon of the Chernigov Mother of God. he was already long dead. His death was supernaturally revealed to his beloved brother in Christ. At the same day, Blessed Philophus, being miles away in the wild regions of the Conda River, said to those who surrounded him, "Our brother John has passed away. Let us go from here." And he at once returned to Polsk. The saint was buried in his cathedral to the great lamentation of his flock, but immediately a series of visions and miraculous intercessions followed, so that there was no doubt of his sanctity. And Tobolsk patiently waited for the day of his canonization. However, this took 200 years, and even then it was almost postponed because of the First World War. It took the ardent intercession of the local Bishop Varnava, the future Patriarch Tikhon, and the martyr Tsar Nicholas II to bring about the long-expected canonization, which took place on June 10, 1960, in the presence of all the Siberian hierarchs and tens of thousands of Orthodox believers from all over Holy Russia. It was the last canonization before the satanic revolutionary storm broke out. The incorrupt relics of St. John are still preserved in Tobolsk today.
There's a lot of similarities with St. John as well.
There's a couple of other things from another aspect of his life. There's some other books that he wrote or writings that he had. The Theatre of Moral Didactic Disgrace, 1708. The Synaxarion on the commemoration of the victory of Poltava, 1710. That was he was referring to Peter the Great. The Pilgrim, which is a manuscript, and Spiritual Thoughts, which was only published in 1782, long after his death. Let's see, where is it? Covered that. Okay, so, who was Metropolitan Peter Mogila?
I thought he was the patron of the monastery.
To the best of my knowledge, Peter Mogila has never been glorified as a saint of the church. However, he was metropolitan in Kiev in the 17th century, during the mid-17th century. This is, as we've heard from some of the other lives, after the destruction by the Poles and the establishment of the Unia. And Peter Mogila was the primary bishop sent in to bring people to Orthodoxy. He established this seminary, theological academy in Kiev, the Kiev College of called here. The language they taught in was Latin. Why?
Would it have something to do with the Poles and Lithuanians?
Yes. And also Latin. Peter Mogila did a lot of westernizing of the Russian Orthodox Church. All of the Western icons.
It was also universal language.
Universal language. The westernized icons start under Peter Mogila, and they proceed into the 18th century and 19th for that matter. But he created a catechism that was used through into the 20th century in the Russian Orthodox Church. It was also based on the Kiev Caves Lavra. Now, we've come across the Kiev Caves Lavra multiple times. And I think you brought this up, or somebody brought it up, that it produced all these bishops and saints we've read lives of several of them, Theodosius of Chernigov, Iosif of Belgorod, and other, Dmitry Rostov. That's all building on the foundation of Peter Mogila. And he is an important hierarch in Russian church history. So it's good to know of him and know something about him. And you brought this up, why did St. John publish the Latropian in Latin first and only later translate it into Russian?
Suppose it was meant to be used in those seminaries where
Actually,
they
he
were
didn't
teaching
translate
it
it.
from?
You see what? He did. He didn't translate it in Russian, he translated it into Slavonic. So why is he translating things into Slavonic rather than Russian?
Well, Slavonic,
The-
not only being
the
the
church
the
language
liturgical language, is also used for the language for discussing the
Theological.
theological concepts. Yeah.
Yes. And so, that's all correct. This in itself, of course, causes problems. Having the Orthodox teaching done in Latin creates its own set of problems, which didn't really become apparent and get addressed until the 19th century in Russia. Let's see.
Well, I mean, a whole bunch of issues have cropped up in the Catholic Church long before that, due to the
Yes.
fact that Latin didn't have some concepts that Greek had, and some words were Greek words were conflated into a single Latin word and things like that.
Correct.
Yeah.
Oh, there's another thing in here that was from one of their lives. St. John was known to have connections with Mount Athos. He had a special interest in the fate of the Russian inhabitants on the Holy Mountain and sent them substantial material aid during these difficult years. His archiepiscopal gramota to the Russian monastery of St. Panteleimon has been preserved, and it testifies to his concern for those on Mount Athos. Who was in charge of Mount Athos during his life?
Turks.
The Turks. So it's hardly surprising that the monks on Mount Athos, even though they had a charter that had been issued by the Turkish Sultan, confirming the previous charters by Byzantine emperors, nevertheless, they were trying to strangle it because Mount Athos always was a center of Orthodox or strict Orthodoxy. There's another interesting aspect. Tsar Peter orders that bishops be sent to the pagan peoples in Siberia, and especially he establishes the see in Tobolsk. When a bishop is ordained, what is he normally ordained? What rank is he normally ordained to? Bishop.
Yeah.
Typically, vicar
Good
bishop.
question.
This is the way in which bishops get trained. We saw this with St. Theodosius of Chernigov. He was originally ordained to Archbishop of Chernigov.
Hmm.
Here, first St. Dimitri, and then Philotheus, and then finally John are ordained to what rank?
Metropolitan.
Metropolitan. And this is following the Russian hierarchy. Metropolitans, well, the patriarch is the first hierarch. Metropolitans are under that. Archbishops and then bishops. Why is a brand new bishop ordained to metropolitan?
Is that because he was being sent to a faraway place on missionary work?
What is what is a metropolia?
It's a city.
It's a semi-autonomous diocese or set of dioceses. And you're right,
You need that if you're that far away.
he's that far away. There is also the ancient practice of not moving bishops around. So that's one of the reasons why the abbot Theodosi of Chernigov was ordained archbishop. He was directly elevated into that see, and he wasn't ever translated. St. John same thing, he was never translated. You'll see that despite that, these bishops do get transferred between a variety of different sees. We see that repeatedly. But there's still some memory that a bishop is ordained for a specific diocese. And you get a diocese out in the middle of nowhere where you have basically no contact with the center of the church, and the bishop's got to be able to operate semi-autonomously, which is why Tobolsk was a metropolia. What happened to his two predecessors?
Well, it said the one of them was going ill and decided to go take the Great Schema, and
And the other one,
I don't remember what happened.
too ill to take the see at all.
Oh, right.
Yeah.
So he was, they ordained him for Tobolsk, but then they said, well, he's not going to Tobolsk, let's put him in Rostov.
Mm.
We'll see with St. Innocent, who's going to be our next life, he dies fairly quickly. And you see a lot of these missionary bishops not having long lives.
It's a rough life.
It's a very rough life. Tobolsk in that time was wild. Maybe still wild.
Still well.
Maybe still wild. And we'll see this even more so in the life of St. Innocent. What's interesting is that Philotheus, actually, he's sick though he may have been, survives St. John.
Some people-
And he's fairly rare in that he's a schema metropolitan.
Mm.
that is-
It's very rare.
Well, maybe that retirement did him a lot of good.
Well, yeah, it did, and his ascetic life did. And he didn't have to take any of the cares of running a diocese. Although he apparently was sent by John out to do more preaching. So he may have been an ascetic, but he's still a missionary. When St. John went to Tobolsk, what did he bring with him?
Church singers.
Yes.
Everything.
Bunch of supplies.
Where did all this stuff come from?
His Chernigov, probably.
Chernigov, Kiev, but more specifically, St. Petersburg funded it.
St. Peter's.
Mm.
I mean, you get the Episcopal vestments, the service books, all these trunks of things. I mean, basically setting up a whole diocese. That costs a lot of money, and it cost a lot of money even in those days. And then who's going to pay all these church singers and clergymen? How do they get paid?
Headquarters.
It's coming out of the
Job.
Tsar. And maybe some of the money gets raised locally, but I mean, Tobolsk isn't going to be a rich diocese, and it's definitely not going to be able to support all these, the clergy, and especially the bishops and the cathedrals and all the rest of that stuff that take a lot of money. So it's being supported by the Tsar. So let's see.
Where is St. John in the petitions and matins and the laity?
Good question. By now, these should be very familiar. I just happen to have the service book with me. In the Save, O God petition, we get the Holy Right believing equally the Apostles Grand Duke Vladimir and the Blessed Grand Duchess of Russia, Olga. You know those. The Wonder Workers of all Russia, Michael, we covered him. Peter, covered him. Alexis, covered him. Jonah, covered him. Philip, covered him. Most of these are patriarchs. Or metropolitans of Moscow. Macarius, Dmitri, Mitrophon, Tikhon, Theodosi, Iosif, covered all those. Hermogen, covered him. Pitorin, haven't covered him yet. Innocent, which we're going to cover next. And John.
That's the last one, yeah. That's where we have the question, yeah, so which John was that? You know,
Yeah, so that John is St. John of Tobolsk.
I looked it up. I think he's last because
He was glorified last.
last to be glorified.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's why. So, and you already brought up that he was an ancestor of John Maximovich, which brings me to the next point, which is, how did he die?
Very similarly to
Mhm.
our Saint
They
John.
both died kneeling before an icon
Kneeling
praying.
before-
And not only an icon,
Of
but
the
a
Mother of
miracle,
God.
a miracle working
Miracle-working
icon of the Mother of God.
That's right, yeah.
Another interesting aspect of it, I mean, that's about as close as you can get. Why didn't they start Vespers?
They're waiting for a blessing.
The blessing to ring the bells. Why didn't they go into his apartment after they didn't get any answer? That's part of it, but that's not the main part.
It was locked.
Well, they had to break open the
break
door.
the door, so it must have been
Yeah.
locked, yeah.
But even more than that,
They didn't want to interrupt him.
you do not break in on the Metropolitan. He, especially since he is a Metropolitan, he's the chief clergyman in the area, and he is a very high rank. And it takes the Siberian governor to, quote, take responsibility upon himself
Right.
to open the door.
Open the door, yeah.
Why did he lock the door?
That's a good question. Why did he lock the door?
To be able to pray and.
Well, presumably, but I mean, he obviously knew, and this is another parallel to Maximovich of
He knew he
San
was gonna be
Francisco.
dying.
He knew he was going to
So
die.
why lock the door?
He wanted them presumably to wait.
Maybe he didn't want anybody to interrupt him.
And he didn't want the, yeah, we don't know for sure, because it's not said, but that's
Wait till he was-
interesting.
It seems, and not, a lot of details of their lives are parallel, but it seems like their personalities too.
Yep, very much. John of Shanghai and San Francisco is a direct disciple of this John. And that is one of the reasons why when St. John of Shanghai and San Francisco was tonsured a monk, he was tonsured in the 1920s.
Got the name.
He was tonsured, this was shortly after his ancestors'
Mhm.
glorification. They gave this John as patron saint to our John. So that's an incredible story. Any other comments or points that people want to bring out on this John of Tobolsk?
Well, more the connection between St. John of Shanghai, that he carried around the relics too on him, some relics of his
Okay.
ancestors.
Well, they made it a point also to go visit Russians in Athos that were suffering, just like St. John of San Francisco.
Okay. Innocent of Irkutsk.
Here's another icon of him.
Did you bring us a map?
I did not know.
So on Michael's map, you go off the edge of the map a lot further east.
All right. Saint Innocent, Bishop of Irkutsk in the World John, was descended from the noble Kolchitsky family. His parents moved from Volhynia to the Chernihiv region. How do you say that? Volhynia. In the mid-17th century. The saint was born in about the year 1680 and educated at the Kiev Spiritual Academy. He accepted monastic tonsure in 1710 and was appointed an instructor at the Moscow Slavonic Greek-Latin Academy as prefect and professor of theology. In 1719, St. Innocent transferred to the St. Petersburg Alexander Nevsky Lavra and was appointed chief naval chaplain. In 1720, he served as vice-regent of the Alexander Nevsky Lavra. On February 14th, 1721, Higher Monk Innocent was consecrated as Bishop of Pereslavl and appointed to the Peking Spiritual Mission in
Peking.
China. Peking? but the Chinese government refused to allow him to enter the country because the Senate Commission on External Affairs had indiscreetly characterized him as a spiritual personage, a great lord. The saint was compelled to spend 3 years at Selingen on the Chinese border, suffering much deprivation because of the uncertainty of his position, and grief from the disarray of the civil government in Siberia. Diplomatic blunders of the Russian mission in China by Graf Ragusinsky and intrigues by the Irkutsk archimandrite Anthony Latkovsky led to the appointment of Archimandrite Anthony in China. By decree of the Most Holy Synod, St. Innocent was named in 1727 to be Bishop of Irkutsk and Nerchinsk, and so he entered into the governance of the newly formed diocese. The proximity of the Chinese border, the expanse and sparsely settled diocese, the great number of diverse nationalities, mostly unenlightened by the Christian faith, the lack of roads and the poverty, all this made St. Innocent's pastoral work burdensome and his life full of deprivations. Through a strange oversight of the Senate, he did not receive any money until the time of his death, and he endured extreme want. In these difficult conditions of scant funds, the Irkutsk Ascension Monastery still maintained 2 schools opened under him, one Mongol and the other Russian. The constant concern of the saint was directed toward the schools, the selection of worthy teachers, and providing the necessary books, clothing, and other provisions for students. The saint toiled tirelessly at organizing the diocese and strengthening its spiritual life. His many sermons, pastoral letters, and directives bear witness to this. In his work and deprivations, St. Innocent found spiritual strength, humility, and insight. In the spring of 1728, the Baikal region began to suffer a drought. Famine from a poor grain harvest had threatened the diocese already back in 1727. With the blessing of the Holy Hierarch in May within the churches of Irkutsk and the Irkutsk region, they began to include a Malaban for an end to the drought at each liturgy. On Saturdays, they sang an akathist to the Mother of God, and on Sundays, they served a Malaban. These supplications, said the saint, should end on the feast of St. Elias. Indeed, on that very day, a storm raged at Irkutsk with such strong rains that in the streets of the city, water stood up to the people's knees, and thus the drought ended. Through the efforts of St. Innocent, construction was started on a stone church to replace the wooden one at the Ascension Monastery, and the boundaries of the diocese were expanded to include not only Selingen, but also Yakutsk and Ilimsk surroundings. The saint, not noted for robust health, under the influence of the severe climate and his afflictions, departed to the Lord at a rather young age, 51. He reposed on the morning of November 27, 1731. In the year 1764, the body of the saint was discovered incorrupt during restoration work on the monastery's Tikhvin church. Many miracles occurred not only at Irkutsk, but also in remote places of Siberia, for those who flocked to the saint of prayer. This moved the Most Holy Synod to uncover the relics and glorify the saint in the year 800. 1800. In the year 1804, a feast day was established to celebrate his memory throughout all Russia on November 26, since the sign icon of the Mother of God is commemorated on an actual day of his repose, November 27th. St. Innocent is also remembered on February 9th. In 1921, the relics of St. Innocent were taken from their shrine and placed at a Soviet anti-religious museum. They were moved to another museum in Yaroslav in 1939 and were exhibited as mummified remains of an unknown man. In 1990, they were brought to the newly reopened Tolga Monastery in the Yaroslav diocese. In September of 1990, the holy relics arrived in Irkutsk and were placed in the cathedral to the joy of the faithful. That's all I have.
It's also, after they rediscovered his relics and they moved him back to Irkutsk, his vestments were also found and he was revested with the same vestments.
Yeah.
So that's a miracle in itself. How long did he serve as bishop in Irkutsk?
I don't think it was that long.
Well, he was appointed in 1727,
Yeah.
and he died in 1731.
So 4 years.
4
Wow.
years.
Like I said, these bishops don't normally last that long. He also died at a fairly young age, not for you younger people. 51 seems like it's ancient. but I can tell you for a fact, it's very
It's young,
beautiful.
it's very young.
Well, and also, like, he had to spend those years outside of China until he was eventually put
3
in.
years on the border, basically waiting for an assignment which the Chinese are not going to give him.
Yeah.
And also dealing with the envy and machinations of some of the clergy, like this Archimandrite Anthony, who later did become the head of mission in Peking. Peking, by the way, is modern day Beijing. So when was he glorified?
Oh, when did you say that?
1800?
Yeah, 1800, yeah.
When was Saint Theodosius of Chernigov glorified?
1890 something or 1900 something.
1912.
Yeah.
And John of Tobolsk,
1960.
1916. Several of these other saints who were somewhat contemporary, maybe a little earlier than him, why do they wait longer? In other words, why was St. Innocent of Irkutsk glorified earlier?
Well, did they know about the incorruption? Well, they knew about that pretty, you know. Right away.
Well, they knew that St. Theodosius' relics were incorrupt. St. Iosif of Belgrade, another one of these saints who was incorrupt and who was not glorified until the very end of the Russian Empire.
The synod. I might not say the right title for that, but it was that secular overlord synod.
So, the overprocurator,
Yeah.
who was a layman.
Yeah. They weren't ready to move on canonizations for you were saying.
No, from the time of the abandonment of the patriarchy to the restoration of, well, leading up to the restoration of the patriarchy back in 1918. In the 18th century, 19th century, there are not that many glorifications taking place.
So what moves people like St. Innocent up to the front?
Well, there's a couple of things. One might be the grace of God, right? Well, how is any saint glorified? It's because God reveals it, right? And presumably
God knows
impels the
that's the best
people who
time
can do it to go ahead. But the other thing from the standpoint of what Seraphim was saying is, where's Irkutsk? Where's Chernigov? Where's Belgorod?
They're out in the boonies.
Well, Chernigov and
Belgorod.
Rostov and Belgorod are a lot closer to civilization than Irkutsk is.
To Kiev, yeah, not in the center, yeah.
So there is that. I don't know if that has anything to do with it,
Yes.
but it's not inconceivable. Interesting fact: my fourth church, was dedicated to St. Innocent of Irkutsk, down in Medford. When I was asked to move down and take New Martyrs and Confessors of Russia in Milano, I was all simultaneously given St. Innocent's in Medford. Why is that church dedicated to St. Innocent? There's a church down in California dedicated to St. Simeon of Wojciechowski, whom you probably have never heard of. He's another one of these Siberian saints.
I heard of them when we were first Orthodox, and I have a letter from Father Gabriel Keane about
Who
him.
served in his church.
Yeah.
Yes, I knew Father
He
Gabriel.
wrote this letter so carefully, even though he didn't really speak English.
Right.
And he mentioned his church, only one in the whole universe.
That's what he said. Yes, that's what he said. And I think he was right.
Father Gabriel Ken,
Yeah.
I was baptized by him.
Really? Small
Oh.
world.
Mhm. So why are these churches
So there's
named?
probably some Siberian people that lived in
Look
that.
at the map. when the Civil War is lost and the communists take over Russia, where do the people in Siberia flee?
To China.
China.
To China. And when China gets taken over by the communists in 1949, where do the faithful in China flee?
California.
Among other places,
I'm thinking of somebody
Australia.
went to the Philippines.
Well, the Philippines was only a way station.
That was a-
Brazil.
Brazil, South America, they went where they would
South
be
America,
accepted. Australia and South America and the west coast of the United States and Canada is where most of these people settled.
Right.
And there's a whole bunch of people, largely because of St. John or Shanghai and San Francisco, who are in California, who have their roots in Siberia.
Right.
And that's why St. Simeon Bertyrski was dedicated to him, because these people were from his area. And I think that Medford was also similar. The people who founded that church, their roots were they were looking for a familiar saint, and Saint Innocent was one of them.
Mhm.
I think there must have been quite a veneration of St. Simeon Verkhoturski in the early 1900s, because I know that the Grand Duchess Elizabeth, St. Elizabeth, had a special veneration for
Mhm.
him.
Now I gotta look up his name.
So we're going to have to do him.
Another interesting thing about this St. Innocent is that our St. Innocent of Alaska took that name in honor of St. Innocent of Irkutsk.
And why was that?
Well, Alaska's
Because he
another
was a
wilderness.
missionary, I
Yeah,
think.
missionary, yeah.
Yep. Yep, he was born in Siberia, I believe.
St. Innocent of
Innocent.
Alaska?
Yeah.
Oh,
And they were recruiting clergy to go to the wilds of Alaska and convert the natives.
Right.
And he volunteered.
Mhm.
Okay, was there anything else that's going to bring up? I think that was about all I had to say. Anything else on St. Innocent? On any of these saints? Does it strike anybody, I mean, a lot of people will make comments about Peter the First or Peter the Great, how he, he was trying to westernize Russia and bring it into the technology and the fore of European powers and so forth. And he did a lot of that. But he also took over control of the church. And I think it was at 1717 maybe, when the last patriarch Adrian died and Peter did not replace him. That's when he established the Holy Synod with the Overprocurator, made a Department of State. And there's a lot of talk about how later in the 18th century and the 19th century, St. Paisius Velichkovsky ended up having to leave Russia to get monastic tonsure. That wasn't Peter, that was probably, I think it was under Catherine. But he went to Alphos and then settled in Romania. And so, just generally speaking, church life is not considered to have been at its pinnacle in the 18th century. And to some extent even in the 17th century. That's also the 17th century is the time of the schism with the old believers. But not just with these saints, all of whom have their origins when they were born toward the end or the middle of the 17th century. Some of the others we heard about earlier, they're made bishops. They're active toward the end of the 17th century, beginning of the 18th century. There's a lot of saints here. And as you can see, they're wonder workers. Does that surprise anybody?
the adversity.
You get more saints in adverse times.
Mhm.
It's too.
Things weren't comfortable.
It's also a time of expansion,
That's true.
which St. Demetrius thought his life wasn't all that easy. St. Joseph, his life wasn't that easy. St. Theodosi, his wasn't that easy. They're either dealing, or in the case of these men, they're dealing with converting pagans. With the others, they're dealing with illiterate clergy, immoral clergy,
People who really don't have an understanding of the faith.
a lot of pagan practices still
Yeah.
present, and they're striving against all of that. And that's one of the reasons why they're so adamant about establishing schools
Schools
where they
and
can
seminaries.
teach orthodoxy, teach the faith,
Yeah.
and just teach a generation that can bring this to the common people.
Mhm.
Other thoughts? We still have one more of the Wonder Workers in St. Catherine, which I think you volunteered for that one. So Sarah will do Catherine
Is that this week or next week?
next week.
Okay.
Well,
You can explain.
yeah, let's do it next week.
Do we have a class next week? Yes, we do. It's the following week we don't.
Right.
Okay.
So
There are some other saints, Saint Simeon, if somebody wants to do him. Okay.
I have an icon if you need it.
Good, yours. I don't remember it off the top of my head. VERTUR THUR. There's an H in there somewhere. VERTURSKHY, I think it is. Something like that.
Is this the one that?
I'll find it.
Sure.
What year?
Calistoga. I don't remember the year he died.
I have an icon.
What century?
I'll give you.
I don't remember. Well, he's going to be. It's probably similar to this. The end of this, the 17th or probably the 18th century, because he's out there in Siberia, and that this is when Siberia is being Christianized.
Right.
And he was discovered late,
Yes.
long after he was buried.
Yes. Next week, not on Wednesday, but I think it's on Thursday or Tuesday, is the feast day for Saint Ephrem the Syrian and Saint Isaac the Syrian.
That's on Thursday.
Thursday. Those are also, I think, fairly short lives because there's not a lot known about them. Isaac in particular. Anybody want to do them? One or the other of them? Well, I'm just asking for volunteers, Mary. Not Mary, but Sophia. Which one did you want to do?
For St. Isaac and St. who?
Ephraim.
Friend.
You probably have a little bit more on Ephraim.
Yeah, you're gonna find a lot more on
So do you want to go for him?
Yeah, I'll do a friend.
Very good.
But I think we can squeeze them both in. So who wants to do Isaac? He's an interesting man. Very interesting.
Mary, do you want to do
No.
Was that a
That
no?
was a no.
I can do him.
Okay. What do we know? What pops to the front of our mind when we think of Saint Ephrem the Syrian?
Prayer of Saint Ephraim,
Hmm?
The prayer of Saint.
done
Prayer of
during
Saint
Lent,
Ephraim.
which we are going into rather shortly.
Yeah, I was gonna say, it's coming up.
Didn't he write a lot about Genesis?
He did. He also wrote a whole bunch of hymns in honor of the Theotokos. In fact, he was a great hymnographer.
Did he write, is he the same, this life is given to you for repentance, but peace will be
It's Isaac.
That's Isaac.
Yeah,
Oh, you can quote St. Isaac the Syrian.
that's on the icon upstairs for St. Isaac. It's in English.
Yes.
So it's Saint Ephrem of where?
He's called it St. Ephrem the Syrian.
That's
Syrian.
He comes from, I believe, Persia, but he ends up in Edessa. And he has a very interesting set of travels. Let's just put it that way. In fact, I'll save that for later, because it's just picturesque.
She'll probably find that
She
out.
might find out something picturesque and tell us about it. So is next week going to be the last week of this?
Well, that's the
series?
next thing we need to talk about. Well, we're thinking about what do we want to do beyond this. Now, there are additional saints in this
We
list
could go on.
that we could cover, or we can do something else. We've talked a little bit about that.
I think we should take a break from saints for a bit and move on to a different type of topic.
Fair enough. So what do we want to talk about? Well, let's make that decision next week. And the other thing is, with Lent coming up, what are you going to be doing on Wednesday
We'll be
evenings?
doing the pre-sanctified,
Pre-sanctifieds.
so there'll be a
So-
break from everything during,
Yeah.
unless you wanted to do it during the meals after.
Well, I don't know about you, but I am typically fairly worn out after a pre-sanctified liturgy. Because I haven't been eating.
Then by the time we're done, it's already getting a little bit late.
Yes.
Well, we'd have to do it while we were eating, because it'd be too late.
So
So,
let's
So we can put that up
start by suspending the class during
during
Lent.
the pre-sanctifieds. And if it turns out we've got some grace-filled energy, then we can start adding to it.
There probably a couple of Wednesdays after the week of the Feast of
There
the
are.
Lent meeting. There's probably a couple of Wednesdays still before.
There
it
are.
starts.
Shall we
Oh, okay.
say our final prayer?
We shall.
It truly me to bless thee, the Theotokos, ever blessed and most blameless, and the Mother of our God, more honorable than the cherubim, and beyond compare more glorious than the seraphim. Thee who without corruption gavest birth to God the Word, the very Theotokos thee do we magnify.